Hello, and welcome to the Price School and Bedrosian Center's new series on research and research impact. We're interested in why and how our faculty think about approaching research, why it matters in our communities, and how we hope the research might be used by practitioners and the general community. My name is Aubrey Hicks, and I am the Executive Director of the Bedrosian Center. Today, we're speaking with Daniel Flaming and Anthony Orlando about the new Economic Roundtable report, Locked Out: Unemployment and Homelessness in a COVID Economy. So let's have you guys introduce yourselves. Let's start with you, Dan. Tell our viewers and listeners who you are and what you do.
I'm Dan Flaming. I'm president of the Economic Roundtable. We're a nonprofit urban research group located in Los Angeles. And one of the areas we work on is homelessness.
This is a good place to be doing research on homelessness, and hopefully you won't have to do it for all the time. Anthony, tell us who you are.
Sure. So I'm Anthony Orlando. My day job is assistant professor of finance, real estate, and law at Cal Poly Pomona, but I'm also a faculty affiliate of the Bedrosian Center. And so it's good to see you again, Aubrey.
I know. There was so much to talk about. I really missed being in the office this week. Okay, so what I like to do is go a little bit backwards. I like to start with what were the key findings and then sort of go back to why we did the research. And then I like to end with solutions. I think a lot of people will just sort of want to tune in for the findings. And so I want to give people a chance to get the findings first and then hopefully get really interested and stay with us as we talk about the rest. So who would like to start? What were the key findings of your report?
So Anthony and I split the work. Anthony looked at the housing side of the homeless issue, and I looked at the labor market side of the issue. And we began with data from the 2008 recession, where we have person-level records about both homelessness and unemployment, and looking at the connection between losing a job, losing income, and losing shelter for some people. For Los Angeles, we estimated that in the 2008 recession, about 10.1% of the people who became unemployed experienced some type of homelessness, maybe couch surfing, maybe on the street, maybe in a shelter. And so we adjusted those ratios for the rates of homelessness and unemployment in different parts of the country and projected them onto the current recession. And we estimated that it's possible we might see twice as much homelessness out of this recession as the last one. And this is a hard recession to predict because it's so volatile, it happens so quickly, but it is centered on the industries where low-wage workers are employed. So it's emerging out of restaurants and retail and hotels and entertainment, where there are a lot of low-wage workers. And our strongest labor market recommendation is we need to provide jobs for people.
I think that was an excellent summary. I think one of the things that we find in an area like Los Angeles County that makes all these things so intricately tied to homelessness is a couple of things. One is it's a high housing cost area to begin with. So we went into the recession with that challenge. So you add the job losses, and particularly, as Dan is saying, where those job losses are focused on people who are in precarious working arrangements to begin with. You add that onto an area where it's already difficult to afford housing. And the second thing is that we have a population where there are a lot of groups that are vulnerable to precarious economic circumstances. And what I mean by that is, for one thing, we have a very diverse population, which I've always felt is one of the strengths of Los Angeles. But at a time like this, unfortunately, we're finding that African-American families and Latino families are much more likely than white families to experience precarious housing problems, precarious employment problems. And they were in that state, that vulnerability going into the recession. So now you add the unemployment onto that, and you are creating, unfortunately, a recipe for very high homelessness if we don't do anything about it.
Is there a correlation at all between the actual COVID numbers and job losses, or is that data not available yet?
We don't have data about the relationship with COVID infections. We do have estimates about the relationship between unemployment and homelessness, and we had an extraordinarily abrupt, massive unemployment. So in the single month from March 15th to April 15th, unemployment increased something like 50-fold. There was just, it's a remarkable spike. And then there has been a fairly quick recovery, and now unemployment is increasing again as COVID infections rise, and we have to have social distancing. So there is a relationship between unemployment and homelessness. It's a lagged effect because people do everything they can to hang on to a roof over their heads. They borrow from friends, they go into credit card debt, they stall rent payments. And the federal stimulus funds and have been very helpful in providing cash flow for people, and the new stimulus will help. But there are still people being displaced from housing, and there's a large backlog of unpaid rent. Anthony has interesting ideas that he developed about that, and interesting recommendations for dealing with this problem of unpaid rent. But it's a big issue in Los Angeles.
Yeah, I think first of all, to add a little something about the pandemic itself that you're asking about, I think that it is very difficult, or it has been difficult throughout the last year, to keep track of how this moving target is affecting everything, right? Where the hot spot is in the country keeps jumping around. And I know because I've tried to do research to see how COVID cases and deaths are correlated with different things. And the areas where COVID is most concentrated at any given time tends to change. I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, talking to students and folks in the real estate industry and showing them evidence from previous pandemics that showed that the areas that did not adopt masks and other kinds of interventions early on not only had more deaths, but they also wound up having a worse recession and a slower recovery. And so that was evidence that suggested that this time around, it's not a bad thing to adopt public health protocols to try to protect people, because it actually will benefit the economy as well in the long run. Unfortunately, it's been very difficult to measure that as this pandemic is going on to see if it's following the same pattern. But most of the economic research that I've seen has showed that. Now, our research doesn't get into that at all because it's such a moving target. But one thing that I do think is important for the connection that we're making is there is some historical research that shows that pandemics tend to increase inequality, which shouldn't be too surprising, right? Most of our recent recessions have tended to increase inequality, and pandemics tend to, unfortunately, harm the people who don't have access to the best health care, who are already in a vulnerable state. The reason I say that's important for our findings is because one of the things that we're trying to highlight is how inequality in urban areas creates a situation where job loss leads to homelessness. I have some other research that Dan and I had talked about that helped to motivate our work, where along with Ben Henwood, also at USC, and Tom Byrne up at Boston University, where we show that increases in city-level inequality leads to increases in homelessness. And so in urban areas, you've got this really difficult problem where you've got wealthy folks in high productivity areas like Los Angeles. They're drawn to that area and they push up the housing prices, but you've got a large chunk of the population, because of that inequality, who can't afford those housing prices. And they're the ones who are on that vulnerable margin that Dan is talking about. Mm-hmm. And so if pandemics tend to increase inequality, if that repeats itself after this pandemic, then it would not be surprising to see the increases in homelessness that we're talking about in the next few years to come. And I always have to put the caveat in, if we don't do anything about it.
Right. And that is the important part. We'll get to that in a bit. As I was reading about the 2008 recession, I found it interesting that what you saw was a little bit of an increase in homelessness as the recession hit, and then it grew for 3 years afterwards. How does that how does that fact sort of factor into what you're thinking about in terms of predicting what might happen now? That sort of growth of homelessness over time.
We applied that profile to the current recession. One of the powerful predictors of homelessness is social isolation. So if you're in a family with multiple wage earners or multiple sources of income, you have the resources to provide some backup for each other, and one person filling in while another's on hard times. But if you're isolated, you don't have that backup. It's you or the sidewalk. And when you think of the labor force that is vulnerable, it tends to be young adults. Mm-hmm. Tends to be people with part-time minimum wage jobs, and you can burn through your fringe. You can use up your social capital when you hit hard times. People let you couch surf for a while, but they're already overcrowded. They already have a hard time putting food on the table. So over time, people's social resources run thin, and if they don't get reconnected with work or some source of income, that's when they face eviction, they face sleeping in a homeless shelter, maybe camping out in the open. But that's when they hit really hard times, is after they've burned through their social capital.
There are delays in the labor market that make what Dan's describing even worse. After every recession in recent memory, unemployment has remained elevated long after the economy, I put in air quotes, the economy, meaning GDP, income, and so on, have started bouncing back a long time after. Mm-hmm. And part of that is because things like consumer spending and business investment can bounce back because the people who have cash can spend it and invest it. But when a business decides that they're going to start investing again, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to hire as many people as they had on staff previously. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that they might have had too many people to begin with. They might have had more than they absolutely needed in order to produce a certain amount of output. And during the recession, because of necessity, they figured out how to get leaner and meaner and more efficient. Mm-hmm. Recessions also come with the problem of accelerating things like automation. And so when the recession is over, a worker finds that their job is no longer necessary. The company figured out how to get on without them. Mm-hmm. And then the second problem is that companies make decisions like hiring for the long run. They want to know that if they're going to hire a new group of workers and they're going to invest in training them, the workers are going to stick around for a while. Well, in the early part of the recovery, they don't have the confidence to know that the recovery is really started and is going to last. Think about where we are right now. You've got experts all over the map saying, how fast is the economy going to grow this year? How quickly are vaccines going to be rolled out? It's extremely difficult for a business to know right now, whether it's worth investing in a worker that they're hoping they're hiring for the next couple of years. They don't know if they're going to need that worker for the next couple of years yet. And so they won't take that leap for a while. So you've got unemployment remaining elevated for a while. You've got this delay in the job market where even though the economy has recovered, a lot of people are still without a job. And then layer on top of that what Dan is saying, which is while they're without a job, they're burning through their resources. They're getting to, the end of their rope. And so we see that unemployment remains elevated. And then the interesting thing that we find in this report is that homelessness becomes elevated even longer thereafter.
So let's go back and look at when you started thinking about doing this project. What made you think about doing this?
Well, Anthony and I have both been working on issues of homelessness for a while, and we have, I think, different paths into the issue that fortunately converged for this report. From the Roundtable's point of view, we've been concerned that Los Angeles has been losing ground on homelessness, that we've had bond issues approved by voters in the county, voters in Los Angeles City. We've invested substantially in housing, and the problem is growing faster than the solution. The city auditor has said recently that it looks like the outlay is $600,000 per unit. And so our concern is that we think it's going to be very difficult to build our way out of homelessness. And when we've looked at data about the employment histories of homeless people, we see that 2/3 of homeless folks are making some sort of effort to earn a living. It might be panhandling, it might be recycling, it might be they're out there looking for a job in the formal economy, maybe they even have one. The low-hanging fruit is young adults, parents with kids, and new entrants into homelessness. All of these groups have very high rates of active job seeking. The jobs they've held have often been part-time and pretty low earnings out of it, but our view is that's a social asset, that people's motivation to support themselves through work and get pay rent in the open market is a social asset, and that it's a more effective solution, and there's more human dignity than waiting for victimhood and waiting for the chronic homelessness and disability of the individual.
Right.
So our push has been on for a while now, has been trying to build employment as a solution. So in this report, that's what we were paying a lot of attention to, is the connection between work and the nature of work people have, and then vulnerability within the groups that are employed, and then the factors associated with being homeless. So we think that the solution of employment is the cheapest and for many people the most effective. It's not a solution for everybody, but for quite a few people it is if we put a thumb on that side of the scale. So that's our path into this project.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't realize or are maybe unwilling to go down this path, to think about how much more expensive a lot of public policy problems are to fix afterwards than to prevent beforehand. Right. And unfortunately, I think the way that human brains work, we're attracted to a disaster. And we're just fixing whatever the latest thing is that's in front of us. But by then it's become too late,
And in times like this, when there are so many different disasters happening at the same time.
Yes. Yes, extremely difficult, right? I mean, imagine now a new presidential administration coming in and trying to anticipate a long-term problem like climate change or homelessness. No, I mean, this is one of the challenges with our report, why we want to highlight it so much. We know that homelessness is going to increase coming out of this recession. We don't know exactly how much. We came up with a ballpark estimate based on our best statistical models, but it's going to happen over years.
Yeah.
And so now, how do you get policymakers to focus on something that isn't immediate with everything else that's going on right now? That's one of our challenges. I think one of the holy grails in this field of research has been trying to figure out exactly how to do that, not just politically, but statistically, how to do what Dan is saying, which is how do you predict homelessness in advance? How do you figure out amongst a population who is most likely to become homeless? I mean, out of the hundreds of thousands of folks who became unemployed in LA County after the Great Recession, the vast majority of them didn't become homeless, right? So there are a combination of factors that have to be at play. It has to be people who come in with particular vulnerabilities to begin with, and then you add that job loss on top of it, and it triggers them into an insecure housing situation. One of the things that excited me about working with the Economic Roundtable is that they had been working on exactly that. So before this report, Dan and the Roundtable had been building a predictive model to try to look individually. They have individual records of different folks and trying to look at what are the things that are correlated with an eventual act of homelessness, and whether that's a one-off, a temporary homelessness, or chronic or repeated bouts of homelessness. And they kind of break up that. And I was excited about that because I'd been thinking about it in the big picture mostly. I'd been thinking about, like I talked about, the relationship between inequality and homelessness, city level factors. But one thing that came out of that research is, as important as inequality is, it doesn't explain a lot of what's going on. There's a lot of individual specific factors that, frankly, would be really important for service providers to understand, social workers, people who are on the ground. I always feel like when I write about inequality, sometimes I'm writing about an issue that maybe is too big because people just can't get their arms around it. Well, what am I supposed to do about inequality? Yes, I'll vote for certain politicians, but beyond that, how do I control something so large? One of the great things about what the Economic Roundtable is doing is creating tools that people can actually use on the ground. And so I think it was the connection of those two things, Dan having a really great understanding of the factors that are contributing to homelessness, and me trying to track the macro level changes that are going on, that we said, okay, job loss is going up significantly. That's a big macro level factor. How do we connect that to what we do know about homelessness, which is a tricky thing to predict.
Are there surprises that you came across as you were working towards finding out how you were going to model your project?
One of the things that surprised me was the number of people who are homeless and still doing some kind of work, but not earning enough to pay for shelter.
Yeah, you said 2/3. That's
within
the myth,
Yeah, well, that if you take out the panhandling and take out the recycling, if you look at the formal economy, we estimate that 44% have worked in the past year or are working now. And one of the things that caught our attention is that there's kind of a direct line between the jobs of workers who are homeless, and they look very much like the jobs of poverty workers, who we define as workers with less than $13,300 a year in earnings. So homeless workers look like poverty workers, and poverty workers look like underemployed workers, people who have involuntary part-time work. So they tend to be young adults, tend to be ethnic minorities, tilted toward women. Women are overrepresented in this group, tend to be less educated, not to have a for your college degree, and with risks going up a lot if they don't have a high school degree.
Yeah.
But these same set of people you see kind of falling off each successive cliff in these risk hurdles that they face. And so it does begin with an issue of economic equity and of providing genuine opportunities for people who want to work, and thinking about how we fairly compensate people for work so that they can, in fact, pay for the necessities of life through work. We were concerned, too, about who some of the employers are of low-wage workers. Homeless agencies and social service agencies are prominent. Churches are prominent. I mean, of course, the big players are restaurants and retail, but universities are part of it too. I mean, the frontline workers who serve food and do janitorial work and maintain the grounds, often they have difficulty getting by. So for nonprofits like the one I work for and other nonprofits, and whose mission calls on us to help people and benefit the public, that we need to be thinking about our own employment practices as well as calling on society as a whole to give people a chance to survive in life through their work.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think that it underscores something that was an important takeaway for me, which is just how hard people will work to try to make a living and to try to get through a crisis. And you don't just see it in terms of their income and the fact that they're working and might still be homeless. They're just working whatever hours they can. You also see it in the housing market, where so many people who you would expect, based on the amount of income loss they have and the amount of savings they have saved up, would be unable to pay their rent, or even if they can barely squeeze out the rent, they might figure out a way to, maybe it's a little bit better to just forget about it this month if the landlord has an eviction moratorium on. No, most renters are paying their rent because they want to. Mm-hmm. I get, as a public policy scholar, I get a little upset when I hear stereotypes suggesting that there is a huge chunk of the population out there who are just trying to get away with getting, right, free things. They must love this eviction moratorium. No, they're struggling. Yeah. They're struggling very badly, according to the surveys that we're seeing. And the percentage of their income that they have to pay in housing costs is, in some cases, astronomical. Over half of poor families in the United States pay over half of their income in housing costs. That's a lot. And your income is already below the poverty line, and you are paying over half of that for housing. You don't have much left over for anything else. You're certainly not. You're just barely covering food and transportation and maybe clothing. You're certainly not paying for any of the extra things that we know are important for, say, childhood development. Forget about tutoring. Forget about private schools. Forget about even decent health care. Mm-hmm. You're getting the bare basics of what you can get, and that is it. You are stretching every penny. So I was impressed with how hard people are working when they're in difficult situations to try to stretch it out. Now, as Dan has said before, there comes a point where the arithmetic doesn't add up, and at a certain point, they will come to a breaking point. Yeah. But I think that should be a real wake-up call for us, because I think one of the biggest mistakes that we've made coming out of previous recessions is that once the economy started growing again, we declared victory. We said we don't need any more stimulus. We don't need to reform the safety net. Everything is going back to normal. Right. And that's clearly not the case. I think one of the problems with rising homelessness over the past decade is that a lot of cities were late to the game. Now, like Dan's been saying, Los Angeles has passed bond measures. They're trying to spend the money. They're trying to house the homeless. A lot of that stuff came years after the recession is over. If we knew then what we know now, We could go back to 2007 and 2008 and start attacking the homeless problem then. Mm-hmm. Start trying to build housing and convert vacant units into affordable housing and provide service providers with what they need to help people on the ground. So here we are again. Are we going to do it?
Behind, yeah.
Or are we going to wait until people really do reach the end of their rope and by then they're already on the street?
Yeah. The Center on Social Innovation recently did a rent burden study, and it was a survey of two of the opportunity zones here in LA. And the numbers of people with just regular rent burden of 30% more, 30% going to rent was staggering. And then you pull in the extremely rent burden who are paying more than 30%, 50%, 60%. And, asking folks what they were doing. And so many of them are giving up clothing for the kids, shoes for the kids, good food, in order to pay rent. And that, again, was before COVID. So one thing that I found that Social Innovation shared that I thought was interesting, and I wonder if you saw this as well, is that recent immigrants, because of the things that they had done in order to get to the U.S., things like living in multifamily homes, and those sorts of things where they had already sort of cut back on all of the sort of extras. They were having a little bit less rent burden because they had already sort of built some of these things into their lifestyles. Did you find anything like that or did you even look at immigrant status? I don't know if that's in the data that you were looking at.
We've seen that in other recent work that we've done, that that immigrants are more likely to live in multi-generational families, multi-generational households, and also more frequently accommodate overcrowding and thereby make rent manageable. I would say, however, that Latinos are prominent among the people at risk of homelessness in this recession, even with family ties and efforts, very pragmatic and very hardworking efforts to survive. What we found was that at every income level, Latinos were about twice as likely as European Americans to be homeless, and that African Americans were about 3 times as likely as European Americans to be homeless.
I'm actually in the process of writing a book right now on redlining, historical mortgage discrimination, and I'm in the process of writing about the Great Migration. And you see how as Black families moved from the South to northern and western cities like Los Angeles or Chicago, they predominantly followed the path blazed by previous people from their same communities, because they wanted to know that when they got there, they would have that social network. And even today, when we run experiments where we give people housing vouchers and we say, you can move anywhere you want from here, a lot of them don't move to where we think they'll move. We think they'll move to an area with lower poverty, better schools, and some of them do. But a lot of them are really concerned about giving up on that network of family and friends who are around them. Mm-hmm. And I think what we often don't appreciate when we are studying the economics of poverty is just how unstable the lifestyle is, how much volatility and risk is involved in it. If all you ever did was compare, well, the wages are higher over there than they are over here, why aren't you living over there? Then their actions don't make sense. Right. But if you consider the fact that they know that when a recession like this one hits, they are at a high likelihood of job loss. They've been through it before. They've seen their community go through it before. They don't need a report from Dan and me to show them that. They know what the risks are, and they are looking for the support system as best as they can cobble together to survive it.
So the data that you worked through from the 2008 recession. Did you work with other data, or did you focus on that to use to predict what's going on? I'm wondering, did you talk to any community members or anything like that? Did you reach out to any of the communities you're studying?
We didn't do a person-level survey work. We did, among the data sources, use the pulse survey that the Census Bureau is putting out every couple of weeks. We used federal unemployment data. We used the public use microdata sample from the American Community Survey. Used a couple. So we tried to pull in all of the, and Anthony pulled in an additional raft of data in his housing analysis. So we drew on secondary sources after the 2008 data. The 2008 data we worked with is person level data. So it's very detailed longitudinal data about people. And then we extrapolated out from the Los Angeles experience to other regions.
Okay.
There's also the challenge anytime you're studying homelessness with the fact that around the mid-2000s, the Department of Housing and Urban Development changed the way that they were doing the homeless counts. Mm-hmm. And they made them more extensive, put more funding into them, and they became a lot more rigorous and statistically careful. And so when most of us are studying homelessness, unfortunately, we really only can go back to about 2007 if we want annual data at the city level. Before that, it's ballpark estimates of national and maybe if cities and counties did their own estimates. But, it's unfortunately just a limitation of the data. Right. Unlike with eviction rates or rents or housing cost burdens, which do go back further and which we did go back further to look at in the report. So when we look at the likelihood that evictions will spike up or mortgage delinquency, we made sure not only to look at the last recession, which was unusual because it was driven by the housing market, but also to look at the recession before that. When we speculate in the report about how mortgage delinquencies might go up, for example, we do suggest that it's probably going to be a little bit closer to the previous recession than the last recession, because the last recession was actually driven by the mortgage market and this one is not. Unfortunately, with homelessness, we really only can go back to the last recession. But the other thing I'll add in terms of working with the community is that some of this work is underway and it's just not ready to talk about. But I think Dan can give you a little bit of a preview of the realization project that they're working on, which we just kind of hint about in our report because it's just gotten going.
Thanks for that lead in, Anthony. We've launched a project for homeless community college students, and we're implementing it in partnership with Long Beach City College and a mental health provider called Special Services for Groups. And we're providing housing and mentoring and skill development. A number of labor unions are collaborating in the project to open up paths to jobs. So it's an attempt at an early heavy touch intervention to help employable people get into real jobs that'll support them for the rest of their lives. These are truly beautiful souls who've been through hard times, and the issue is really as much restoring their confidence in themselves, right, as it is finding the right job opening for them. But it's a very exciting project, and it's very, very heartening to see it unfolding. So thank you, Anthony.
So this seems like a great time to get back. We've already talked about some of them, but let's talk about possible solutions that we should do to prevent the homelessness that you're talking about coming.
Well, I'll start maybe, and Anthony had a series of things on the housing policy side that I think are very insightful. But our strongest recommendation is that we should look with discernment at people who are losing their jobs and who are in these high-risk groups, which risk factors include not having a whole lot of education, having low earning history out of work, social isolation compounds it, demographics, including gender and ethnicity, compound it, the job area you've been in compounds it. Any homeless history is a big risk factor. A foster care history is a risk factor. So to look with some discernment at the people who are losing work and who look like they're going to have some real challenges staying housed, and to intervene early with real jobs. And some of this entails, I think, looking back to the WPA during the Great Depression and the things we did to put people to work in the public assets we still have. I mean, the murals, the buildings, the paths in our forests that we still have, the roads that were built. La Brea Boulevard was built by the WPA. So to think about how we can use the productive energy of people who want to work, don't have a job, and build things that society needs. We desperately need childcare right now, so parents can go back to work. We need teaching assistants so we can break out classrooms into pods and give students an actual social interaction during their screen time.
Yeah.
We need care for people who are sick. We need work building affordable housing. We could do a whole lot to clean up national forests that are burning like crazy every summer. There's a lot of places we could use productive human labor. And so that's our recommendation, is to target with discernment and give people real jobs that lead to careers.
So, when you're talking about WPA, are you thinking something federal, or are you thinking local and state level as well?
I think if the work builds public assets or provides a crucial public service, that we should see cities, counties, and states getting involved. But the place where there's a lot of money is the federal government.
Right.
So those are the people who could print money. But I don't think we should leave it all to the federal government. And I think nonprofits and employers in the community also need to shoulder some of this, and the people we employ need to be able to live on the earnings they get from us.
I think one of the things that's important to add to all of that is that it is doable, that it is financially doable, and that it is politically doable. Because I think, especially at a time like this, when there's so much terrible news out there, people can easily get pessimistic.
Right.
But I think what a recession like this does, hopefully, is acts as a wake-up call to make us realize how urgent some of these things are. A lot of the things that Dan has been talking about are things that both he and I knew the country would benefit from before the recession ever hit. And we've been arguing for it in a variety of work. It's just become far more urgent now. I think a perfect example of this is Project Room Key. In the state of California, when the pandemic hit, there was a real concern about folks who were sleeping on the streets and in shelters, who were homeless. Would they catch the virus? Would they spread the virus? And here at the exact same time, you've got vacant and distressed hotel properties because nobody's traveling. Everybody was afraid to use hotels, and their property values are going down. And so what do you do about that? Why not bring the two together? There's a synergy here. So what the state of California did was to start converting some of these hotel rooms into at least temporary affordable housing where homeless families could come to live. There wasn't a clear idea of how long that would last, but it was at least temporarily possible. Now, they housed thousands of families that way. I think all of us would admit that the amount that they were able to house was nowhere near the scale of the problem. It was not enough to make any of us happy, but it was more progress than we've made in a long time. Mm-hmm. And it suggested that if there is a bad enough crisis, the government can mobilize and help people find housing. Now, what we've been saying in our fields is this was a crisis already.
Yeah.
Why did it take this crisis for you to realize that homelessness was a crisis? After the pandemic is over, we should continue to have that crisis mentality for a long time to come until the problem is solved. When I'm teaching finance at Cal Poly, I often have students who are trying to figure out how to predict the markets. And I tell them, my read of the great investors out there is not that they are brilliant at predicting the markets. Maybe they're a little better than the rest of us, but they're wrong almost as often as they're right. They make huge, terrible bets. Their ability to thrive is not their ability to predict what'll happen next, but to prepare for it. Mm-hmm. We couldn't have predicted that COVID would happen, but we could have been prepared for it. We could have had a stronger safety net. We could have had a program like Project Room Key already underway. We could have a government and a nonprofit sector that is more flexible to adapt when a crisis hits, to catch the people who fall into the cracks. In housing, there are basically two categories of ways you can do this: the supply side and the demand side. I'm an economist, so I can't help it. On the supply side, it's how you go about working through the landlords, the owners of the properties, the mortgage lenders, the people who are supplying the housing and the credit. On the demand side, it's the people who are demanding the housing, the people who are using it. How can you actually directly help the tenants and the homeowners? So on the supply side, the problem is we don't have enough affordable housing, first of all. We need to build a lot more of that. And if we can't build it, maybe we can do what Project Room Key is doing, and we can convert vacant and distressed properties into affordable housing. I've heard a couple of stories recently about the government buying or considering buying hotel properties throughout Los Angeles. One number that I heard was that there was a motel on the west side of Los Angeles where it's about $250,000 per door to purchase that hotel property. As Dan said earlier, it's $600,000 a unit to build new affordable housing. Now, even after you pay the $250,000, you've still got to renovate the facilities. You've got to pay the service providers. Social workers have to go out. There's a lot of administration to help people transition to the new housing. But it's hard to imagine that even with those extra costs, it's going to come anywhere near $600,000. So there are cost-effective strategies on the supply side if we're willing to invest in them, make the investments up front so that we're not paying to try to fix the problem after the fact. The other way that you can deal with the supply side is by helping landlords to make their units more affordable. Mm-hmm. One way that we've done this since 1987 is the low-income housing tax credit, which is a federal program that provides subsidies to developers. We will help you build this building if a significant portion of them are rent restricted for only low-income families. And that has been, I think, a very successful program. It has helped to either create or rehab over 3 million apartment units throughout the country since 1987. And the latest research that I've done, along with our friend Raphael Bostic and a few others, has shown that in neighborhoods where LIHTC buildings, we call it LIHTC buildings are placed, not only does it create new affordable units, but it also increases the home values for the homeowners around there. So you talk about how to reinvest in areas that need it without causing too much gentrification or displacement. There's a potential way to do it. Another more urgent way that we can do it now is by providing financial incentives to landlords and lenders to forgive unpaid rent and unpaid mortgages from the past year. The eviction moratoriums did a lot of good and continue to do a lot of good, but what happens at the end of them? A lot of these landlords and lenders, they're not forgiving the debts that are accumulating. They're just pushing them off into the future. That's going to be a big bill that's going to come due. One of two things happens if the renter can't afford to, one of two things happens. Either the renter needs to figure out how to pay that big bill, which will be a significant financial burden on them, or they don't pay it. Mm-hmm. And then the default is going to hurt their credit score for years to come.
Right.
And it's going to be a loss that company is going to take. Mm-hmm. Now, you might not be concerned about the big corporate landlords, but in cities like Los Angeles, a lot of the apartment buildings are owned by small landlords operating on thin operating margins, profit margins, just like the small restaurants and other small businesses that are suffering during this recession. Wouldn't it be better for everyone if the government could help cover part of their losses, give them financial incentives, and they could just then forgive that debt without taking a huge loss? Everybody winds up better off in that equation. On the demand side of things, well, that's actually much simpler. You just help people pay for their rent. We have a housing choice voucher program, also known as Section 8. Most people have heard about it. What most people probably don't realize is that most people who are eligible for it don't get it.
Yeah.
So we have a program that has the federal government sets an eligibility threshold. And
when
they
say,
say,
when
here's
you
the
don't
income.
get it, I want to be clear. When you say don't get it, you mean don't apply for it.
Both. So they either don't apply or they do apply and they wind up in a lottery or on a waiting list because there isn't enough money.
Okay.
Or they apply, and this is a problem throughout the social service sector. They apply, but they don't fill out the form correctly. Somebody doesn't, explain it to them correctly, and they get dinged because of a technical error and they never get the money. All of these problems happen, and the end result is that 3/4, 75% of people who are eligible for the vouchers don't get them. Now, to me, that's crazy. Look, if you want to give vouchers to fewer people, then set a more stringent eligibility threshold and make sure that everybody who meets it can get the vouchers. But that's not what we're doing. We're saying we're going to set the threshold at a reasonable level where we think anyone who's under that threshold is probably having serious cost burden problems. And then we're going to say, good luck, only 1/4 of you are going to get the help. That is not a sensical way to run the program for me. In the report, we call for it to be fully funded. That's a little bit more expensive, but again, as Dan has said, helping to prevent things like homelessness by helping people pay their rent now pays off for society in the long run. It would be a lot more costly to have to deal with what happens if they get evicted because they can't afford to pay their rent.
That is a lot that we can actually do. Do you both feel hopeful that we will do some of these things?
I mean, this is a time of crisis nationally. It's a time of political crisis, economic crisis, health crisis. So there is a reason to, I think, be hopeful that we will open our eyes in fresh ways, take a fresh stock of ourselves, and have confidence that we can in fact solve some of these problems rather than waiting for them to happen and grow on us. So I think there's a possibility that we can take a fresh look at ourselves, and we're having to solve a lot of other problems. This is one of them. And it is small. It's a smaller problem than vaccinating every person in the country, I think. So if we can solve that problem, maybe we can solve this one too.
I like that. Do you have anything else to add before we close up?
I don't have anything to add. I have really enjoyed talking with you, Aubrey, and with you, Anthony. So thank you for this invitation and for letting me be part of it.
Well, thank you so much for spending time with us today. It's an important to think about. It's just such a great project, and I'm looking forward to finishing my read. So thank you. Anthony, did you have anything to add before we?
Oh, I mean, I agree. Thanks for the opportunity. It's been a lot of fun, and it's always fun catching up with you. I think that one thing that I've actually taken away from the last couple of days as we've been talking about the report to reporters and just anybody who's reading it is at first when people see the headlines, they think, oh boy, this is grim. And they're right. Mm-hmm. Actually, I think it was the Seattle Times that called it a grim study. And that's because it's a grim reality. It is. But I prefer to see it as an opportunity.
Yeah.
And I think once people dig in a little deeper into the report and they start to read about the potential solutions, they might start to see what they can do about it. What kind of a world do you want to live in the generation to come?
Mm-hmm.
This isn't just about this recession. There's going to be another recession after this one and another recession after that one. I don't know when, hopefully a long time in the future. But when it comes, I would like to think that because we wrote and read reports like this, because we actually looked at the facts and we came up with a better way of doing things, that we will have a system in place that doesn't allow people to suffer so much when something like this happens. Again, we couldn't predict that COVID could have happened. And I'm not going to speak to the public health implications of anything, but we could have had a system in place that minimized the economic pain. This was not necessary, and it should not happen again.
And in many ways, I think not planning for the future has led to some of the polarization that we're seeing. And so the more we can do to think forward so that we're not just redoing the inequality and making it worse, I think that'll be better for everyone in the long run. So that's all we have time for today. So thank you so much, Dan. Thank you so much, Anthony. It's always great to see you. And it was great to meet you, Dan. And thank you to everyone who's watching and listening. Please send us feedback. This is a new series, and we're hoping to make it useful for everyone, for practitioners, policymakers, but also for members of our community. So send us any questions you have or comments. I'd really love to hear from you. We are on social media, and you can always email us at bedrosian.center@usc.edu. We've got a whole bunch of podcasts and videos. Check out our website for the links. And today I'm going to add links to some of the things we talked about. So to find that, look at our website, bedrosian.usc.edu/lockedout. And thank you to our guests, Anthony and Dan again, and to my co-producer, Jonathan Schwartz. And a huge thanks to our beloved sound and video supervisors, the brothers Hedden, Corey, and Ryan. I am Aubrey Hicks, for coming to you from the University of Southern California Price School of Public Policy. And I will catch up with you with new and interesting research soon.